Hello again, everybody. It's Dr. Elizabeth and Reverend Rick drawing you into a conversation about The Sum of Us, a great book by Heather McGhee, former head of the executive director of Demos, which was a think tank focused on voting rights and people's access to democratic principles. And our chapter, this is our fourth episode, and our chapter is entitled No One Fights Alone. So I'm going to start us off by asking Elizabeth, what does she mean with the title, No One Fights Alone?
Well, she took the title from a T-shirt that a Black woman who worked at the Nissan plant in the South, I can't remember what state it was.
It was Canton, Mississippi.
Mississippi, correct. And her shirt said, "No one fights alone," which is the purpose of a union. That when workers unite across race, no one fights alone means that everyone prospers together. And sadly, the power of unions has not only, sort of been suppressed throughout the culture, but it has been sort of intentionally used all the way back from Reconstruction forward to pit the people at the bottom of the pyramid, regardless of what their color is, to pit them, excuse me, against one another, so that even if you're a poor white in Mississippi or someplace else, and your interests would be better served by uniting with Black people of the same class. The notion of racism lets you believe you're one step ahead of them because you're white. And that principle theory has been projected into the union struggle. And so in fighting alone, neither workers, whether they're Black or white or brown, benefit from the solidarity with each other, and they're pitted against each other in that zero-sum way she talks about. That, if we work with Black folks for Black folks, economic prosperity, then there won't be any for us.
Right, and that's just what happened in the Nissan factory vote, which defeated the union campaign to unionize there, and they lost by a narrow margin. But it was by virtue of that kind of divide and conquer mentality. But
well, and she makes an interesting point that I had not really thought about. She talks about the strength of the UAW as it developed in the Midwest, in Michigan and Ohio, and how unions there had worked well enough together to guarantee, health benefits and worker safety and that kind of thing. And that when the foreign car companies came to build in the United States, they settled in the South because things like right to work and this long history of racial oppression already existed there. And that was something they could exploit to pay their workers less.
Right. Well, this all started, of course, unionization started in partly in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania and West Virginia coal mines, and in Colorado as well, long ago, following the Civil War. And she does mention that the first organizing was done by the Knights of Labor, of which one important organizer was Mother Jones, a Irish immigrant, as I said last week, who had come here and worked in the South and then in Chicago. And somehow, oh, I know what it was now. It was the Chicago fire in the 80s sometime, when she witnessed, she was a seamstress for very wealthy people. And she witnessed in that fire that all of the wealthy people managed to get themselves to safety at the lakeshore, but the poorer population could not and did not, and suffered tremendously. And that galvanized her right off the bat. And she picked up and took herself, at that point, a long time a widow, and no children. She picked herself up and became a foot soldier in the unionization process in these coal mines. There's a very famous movie about this in which she's not mentioned, but she figured in the actual story. It's a movie called Matewan, Matewon. It's one of the minefields in West Virginia. It's a hard movie to find, by the way. I tried to locate it. And in those initial fights, they very intentionally sought out interracial participation. Again, I don't even think it was so much, well, we'll do better if we're together, which of course would be true, as much as this is the right thing to do. We just, we work side by side. And it's a terrific story, and I don't know that there's a movie about her to be found. A feature film that tells that story. But that was the beginning of unions, the United Coal Mine Workers, United Coal Workers, and they, of course, ran into trouble right away. She did, because she immediately had conflicts with the new union leaders of the new union. This is all very early in the process, and this starts the story that became part of the issue around unions in the 1940s and 50s of union corruption. She was very clear about the fact that the early union leaders really did not have the workers' interests at heart. And she was, I don't know, she was, I guess, she was charmed by, I don't know, some angel that protected her. But she did suffer tremendously, but she was never attacked in her person as many others were. And it's an enormous story of bravery in that era. And I should say, for full disclosure, I am a former member of the UAW. For 2 summers in my college years, I worked in a factory, a John Deere factory, on the assembly line in East.
I remember you preaching about it.
Oh, I did. I told that story. Well, it marked me. It's the kind of thing that marks you, being surrounded by intense heat, noise, inhuman surroundings, inhospitable, the concrete, the steel, and the danger. Of course, I was spared that because I was one of the half dozen or so college kids they hire in the summer to plug in to the assembly line when the workers take their week or 2-week vacation. And that was a rather cushy job. It wasn't without its dangers, but certainly they didn't put us in the forge or in plenty of other dangerous situations, which I passed every day walking back and forth to my assignment. So it was quite an experience, and I will always understand from that the absolute essential necessity of unions in these in the American workplace, in the world workplace. And of course, now we're learning from Heather McGhee, as I did not know at that time, the impact on on Black workers who might have been excluded. And, I think I have to go and do a little research in my memory or the people that I knew at that time and learn how integrated those unions were where I worked. So I got my education from Heather McGhee on that particular score.
The one thing I learned from this chapter, as I have from all the others, but I did not realize that the Knights of Labor were organized directly in response to Reconstruction, which she points out in this chapter, that the foundation was uniting poor whites and poor Blacks in the South, and it spread and grew from there. But she also points out, which I don't think will surprise anybody, but that the class struggle became less important than racial solidarity. And it didn't matter if you were a white person at the bottom of the heap with Black people. You still had standing and privilege as a white person above the Black worker. And so that unspoken agreement meant that you would not align your interests with the Black workers who were the same class you were. And it doesn't surprise me, but I did not realize what a threat the rise of unions must have been in the South, where this social hierarchy had been in place forever. And well, of course they fought it. Why wouldn't they? The powers that be, because they can see the danger of class interests privileging racial interests. And they're not going to let that happen.
Well, fast forward, since those days, our economy has changed several times. Manufacturing has declined, obviously, and that meant a decline of the amount of people employed by factories, and the unions declined with that. But now there are nationwide workers in industries that are not consolidated like General Motors is. So you think of all the fast food enterprises, and she writes about that and how they lobbied to raise their wages, and they shot for the moon. They went for $15 an hour goals, and did they succeed? I'm trying to.
They did in
notes.
some states, not in others. There has been throughout the history of unions a great class struggle. And during the Reagan presidency, it seemed to become much more intentional. When the air traffic controllers went on strike, Reagan fired them. So there wasn't, the message had been given that if you organize, we will fire you. You won't have a job at all if you don't let us define what the conditions for your job are. And that's sort of been the pattern that we've seen through the financial crisis as well, that a low wage job is better than no wage at all, or at all. And so rather than organize to make sure that workers, no matter their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, whatever, have access to organizing, which in some places the Supreme Court just handed down a decision last week on whether or not unions could be on the farmers' property to talk to migrant workers, and said they could not. So there still is this concerted effort by the institutions and the structures of the United States economy and government that really pit workers against one another.
Well, and absent these unions now in industries which are employing large numbers of people, the African American worker is thrown into the national pot, and where racial discrimination is still very real, and
Well,
and there aren't
look
even
at
unions for them.
well, look at what happened to the migrants and immigrants who were working in the meat industry during the coronavirus. You know, they died in huge numbers because nobody was interested in protecting them, and they were forced into small spaces next to each other without the proper safety equipment, and there was a huge toll taken on those workers.
It's true. Something that she doesn't touch on, unless you spotted it in your reading, Elizabeth, is that there have evolved, of course, a whole category of unionized workers who are not blue collar workers. They're white collar workers, like teachers, graduate students, and postal workers. And I don't know anything about their record with respect to racial integration, and maybe that's something we could look into.
Well, I don't know if it's in this chapter or if I've heard her talk about it. But she does talk about, in academia in particular, the move to not have tenured professors and hire all these adjuncts who get no benefits. My stepson went to Ithaca, and he was floored when a physics professor, a person with a doctorate in physics, was an adjunct and who was working 2 jobs and on food stamps because there were no benefits that went with her teaching responsibilities. And she had a PhD in physics.
Well,
there's a problem there.
That cuts twice, because not only are fully possibly tenured faculty exploited this way, but also academia is not a place that's replete with African American presence. I mean, it's been a fight to get Black faculty, and indeed a lot of the conflict in colleges now is that they have succeeded in raising the African American student population, but it has been much more difficult doing that on the faculty and staff end.
Well, look what just happened at the University of North Carolina with Nicole Hannah-Jones. And an incredibly qualified person. I'm really glad that once they were forced to grant her tenure, she said no.
That was a good move.
She went to an HCBU.
Right. She went to Howard, right?
She went to Howard along with Tanisha Coates.
Right.
So talk about cutting off your nose just by your face, which is what, I think that could be the subtitle of this book. These are 2 brilliant people whose gifts we don't want to appreciate as an entire society. And think of all the experience and wisdom that we're just letting go of because these, I guess, supposedly uppity Black scholars, don't have the right to know what they know and to teach what they know.
Well, if people would like to be exposed to a little of that brilliance, they should watch some of certain cable news shows
Mhm.
that feature guests who come from, the academic world, the business world, and so forth, that are absolutely stunning in
Mhm.
what they have to share. And of
Mhm.
course, this started back when Barack Obama was running for president, and then through his 2 terms their presence was increased, at least in certain cable news shows. And it's it just uh, is further evidence of this cutting off your nose to spite your face, because you sure want them on your team.
Well, and that, I know people have nasty things to say about Twitter and that nasty things happen on Twitter. But one of the things I really enjoy about Twitter is the number of um, Black scholars, Black lawyers, people that I wouldn't ordinarily
Mhm.
know much about. I'd see articles by them, and yeah, I've read. I didn't know who Eddie Glaude was, who's a
Oh, yeah.
professor of. He's the chair of the African American Studies program at Princeton, and is a former chair or whatever they call it of the American Academy of Religion.
Mhm.
But I read his Democracy in Black and his book about the new one he has called Begin Again, which is about James Baldwin. But I would not have known about those
No,
books
no.
had I not been making a conscious decision that on Twitter I wanted to follow these voices that I wasn't exposed to anywhere else.
Well, we should say together something like, "Get with it, white America." We're being, we're being passed up in this short-sightedness. Now, listen, we've used up our time again. It just went so
Oh,
fast.
fancy that.
Fancy that. Just talk, talk, talk. We do. Next week, it is Never a Real Democracy, and we look for all of you back. And I hope you'll keep those cards and letters going. Nice chatting with you, Elizabeth.
As always, it's too fun.
Yeah. Till next time, everyone. Bye for now.
Blessings all.
Bye.